The wine glass shattered against the marble floor of the Salvatore Social Club, and every man in the room went for his weapon at once. "Don't you dare talk to me like that again," Odessa Marlowe said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the sudden, ringing silence of the private dining room like a blade drawn slow across silk. The moment replayed itself in Odessa's mind even as she stood there, heart hammering the tray balanced on her forearm. The familiar weight of ranunculus stems wrapped in damp paper towel. The open double doors of the dining room throwing warm candlelight into the hallway. She had not meant to stop walking. Her feet had simply refused to carry her past that doorway, once her nose caught the wrong note beneath the wine's usual bright cherry and leather, something faintly green, faintly bitter. A chemical signature her body remembered, even though her conscious mind had spent 11 years trying to forget every detail of the old life that had produced it. She had not thought. She had moved. Crossing the room in 4 quick steps and knocking the glass from Vincent's hand before her brain had fully caught up with what her instincts already knew. Vincent Del Rosso, number 3 in the Salvatore hierarchy. Avire. Sharp-tongued lieutenant, with a habit of testing people who couldn't hit back, froze with his hand halfway to the gun at his hip, more startled by the tone than by anything she'd actually said. He had just watched this woman, this soft, round-faced florist who delivered centerpieces to the club twice a month, knock a full glass of Barolo out of his hand mid-sentence, hard enough to send crystal skittering across the floor. "You clumsy fat," he started. "I didn't spill it," Odessa said, and something in the flatness of her voice made the room's temperature drop several degrees. "I stopped you from drinking it." At the head of the long table, Rocco Salvatore set down his fork. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned his head, slowly, and looked at the woman his men had spent the last 2 years treating as invisible furniture, the florist who came and went through the service entrance, who never spoke unless spoken to, who Vincent liked to make jokes about within earshot because he assumed, correctly for 2 years, and incorrectly tonight, that she would never say anything back. "Explain," Rocco said. One word. Low. Gravelly. Absolutely devoid of patience for anything but the truth. Odessa's hands were shaking. But her voice was not. "That bottle came from the private reserve case delivered an hour ago. It's not supposed to have a floral note. It does. Faint. Bitter. Underneath the tannin. Most people wouldn't catch it after the first glass. I did. Because I've spent 11 years learning exactly what oleander tastes like when someone tries to hide it in something else." Vincent's face went the color of old paper. Rocco Salvatore rose from the table for the first time all evening, and the room, already silent, went utterly still. To understand what happened in the next 6 hours and what it would cost the Salvatore family's oldest rivals before the sun came up over Boston Harbor, you have to understand what Odessa Marlowe actually was. Underneath the flour-stained apron and the soft, unassuming curves that Vincent Del Rosso and men like him had spent 2 years underestimating, she had not always been a florist. 11 years ago, Odessa Marlowe had been a rising pharmaceutical toxicologist at a firm called Ambrose Wells, the kind of brilliant, meticulous scientist who could look at a batch of clinical trial data and see, buried 3 decimal places deep, the exact moment someone had started cooking the numbers. She had found the pattern in a diabetes drug that was quietly killing patients in ways the trial reports, insisted it wasn't. She had taken it to her supervisors. Her supervisors had taken it to legal, and legal had made absolutely sure that by the time the dust settled, Odessa Marla was the one who looked unstable, vindictive, unemployable, blacklisted from every pharmaceutical research position on the eastern seaboard before she turned 29. She had spent a year barely leaving her apartment. She had spent the year after that learning to arrange flowers because it was quiet and tactile and asked nothing of her except beauty, and because the smell of lilies and eucalyptus was the only thing that reliably drowned out the memory of the sterile lab air she used to breathe. Boston Blooms, the little shop 3 blocks from her apartment, had hired her without asking a single question about her past, and for 6 years she had built a small, steady clientele that included, eventually, the Salvatore family men who paid in cash, tipped generously, and had never once, in 2 years of bi-weekly deliveries, bothered to learn her last name. There had been one night, 4 months ago, when Rocco had seen something closer to the truth of her, though at the time, he hadn't known what he was looking at. The Salvatore family had hosted its annual harbor gala at the Whitfield Hotel, an event that demanded every vendor, including the florist, attend in formal dress to oversee the evening's arrangements. Odessa had shown up in a plain black dress bought off a department store rack, apologizing to the coat check attendant before anyone had even looked at her twice. Certain she would spend the evening as invisible as she always was in rooms like that one. Rocco had found her adjusting a centerpiece near the entrance, visibly bracing for the evening, the way a woman braces for cold water, and had done something that surprised even his own security detail. He had asked her, in front of half the room, to stay for dinner instead of leaving after setup, the way vendors always did, when she'd hesitated, uncertain whether it was an order or an invitation. He'd simply said, low enough for only her to hear, "You built the only beautiful thing in this room tonight. It seems wrong to make you leave before anyone gets to see it properly lit." He had then, with a brevity that brooked no argument, sent one of his men to fetch her something from the hotel boutique downstairs, not out of any grand romantic intention. He would insist later, but because he could see, even then, that she deserved one evening where the room looked at her the way it looked at everyone else. She had come back down 40 minutes later in deep emerald silk that the boutique's owner had altered on the spot, cut to skim rather than hide the soft, generous curves. She had spent a lifetime trying to disappear inside oversized cardigans and aprons. She had walked into that ballroom bracing for laughter, for the same sideways glances she'd spent years learning to armor herself against, and instead the room had gone quiet in the particular, helpless way rooms went quiet around something they hadn't expected to find beautiful. Rocco had crossed the floor without hurrying, the way he crossed every room that mattered, and had simply offered her his arm as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Daring, without a single word, anyone in that ballroom to comment. Nobody had. Not that night. Odessa had gone home afterward and told herself firmly that it had been a kindness. Nothing more. The kind of gesture a careful, controlling man made to keep a useful vendor loyal. She had not let herself consider. Until tonight, in the wreckage of a poisoned bottle of wine, that Rocco Salvatore might have spent that entire gala quietly, deliberately building a case for exactly how much attention he'd already been paying her. She had never planned to keep the old skills sharp. But some kinds of knowledge don't fade just because you stop using them on purpose. She still smelled every bottle of wine she poured out of habit. She still noticed the particular telltale bitterness under tannin, the way other people noticed a stranger staring a beat too long. It had taken her exactly 4 seconds tonight. Walking past the open dining room, on her way to the kitchen, with a fresh delivery of ranunculus, to register that something was wrong with the Barolo Rocco Salvatore was about to drink, and exactly 1 more second to decide that she was done being quiet about things that mattered. Rocco Salvatore. For his part, he had noticed her long before tonight. Not the way Vincent and the others hadn't. Rocco noticed everything. Catalogued everyone who entered his spaces. Filed away small details the way other men collected debts. He had noticed that the florist always arranged the centerpieces with the stems cut at a precise diagonal angle, the way a chemist might handle a pipette. He had noticed that she never made small talk, but that when she did speak, every word was chosen with unusual, almost clinical precision. He had noticed. 6 months ago, the faint burn scar on the inside of her left wrist, old and silvered, the kind of scar that came from a lab accident, not a kitchen one. He had said nothing. He had simply filed it away, the way he filed away everything, waiting to see if it would ever matter. Tonight, it mattered enormously. Get everyone out, Rocco said, except her. The dining room emptied in under a minute waitstaff. Guards. Vincent. All of it. A controlled evacuation that spoke to just how completely this family understood the danger of lingering in a room where their boss's temper had gone quiet instead of loud. Rocco Salvatore's fury. Odessa was learning in real time. Did not announce itself. It simply removed all the air from a room and waited for something to break. When the doors finally closed, it was just the 2 of them. The shattered glass, and the untouched bottle of Barolo sitting on the white tablecloth like a coiled snake. Rocco's hands, Odessa noticed, were not entirely steady either, though he hid it far better than she had. He had come within 20 minutes of drinking a bottle of wine that would have stopped his heart mid-conversation. And though his voice had not wavered once since the glass shattered, something in the set of his shoulders told her that the composure was costing him more than he was letting on. Sit, Rocco said, though it wasn't unkind. He pulled out the chair beside his own, not across the table, not at a careful, deferential distance, but directly beside him, close enough that she could see the faint gray at his temples, the deep-set exhaustion behind eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Odessa sat. Her hands, she noticed distantly, had finally stopped shaking. The study around them still smelled faintly of the dinner nobody had finished, roasted garlic, candle wax, the ghost of spilled wine soaking into the tablecloth in the next room. Odessa was aware. In the strange, hyper-lucid way, people become aware of small details during moments of enormous consequence, of how quiet the estate had gone. No footsteps in the hall, no distant clatter of the kitchen staff resetting for dessert, just the low tick of the antique clock on Rocco's desk and the sound of her own pulse. Finally beginning to slow. Tell me everything, Rocco said. Not the short version. All of it. What it is. How it got in. Who had access to that bottle before it reached this table. It's almost certainly an oleandrin extract, Odessa said, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the simple. Familiar relief of being listened to. Cardiac glycoside. In the right concentration, it mimics a heart attack almost perfectly. No obvious trauma. No forced entry. Nothing. A coroner without specific toxicology training would flag, unless they were looking for it. Whoever did this didn't want you dead in an alley. They wanted you dead at your own table. Looking natural, so nobody would think to ask questions. Rocco's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How long would it have taken? Depends on the dose. Given the concentration I'm smelling, I'd estimate 20 to 40 minutes after the first full glass. Enough time for you to finish dinner. Maybe start dessert. Before your heart simply stopped. And you caught it, Rocco said slowly. From smell. Before I'd taken a single sip. I caught it because 11 years ago I spent every day of my life learning to notice exactly this kind of thing. Odessa said, meeting his eyes directly for what felt like the first time in 2 years of bi-weekly deliveries. And because your men have spent 2 years talking around me instead of to me, which meant I heard every conversation in this building that mattered, and nobody ever thought to wonder whether I was paying attention. The two of them sat in a silence that was no longer merely stunned, but had begun, cautiously, to feel like something else, the particular, charged quiet of two people, recalibrating everything they thought they understood about each other in real time. Odessa was aware of her own pulse, still elevated, still riding the aftershock of adrenaline, and aware, too, of how strange it felt to have Rocco Salvatore's undivided attention fixed on her, instead of glancing past her toward whichever more important person he assumed must be standing nearby. Nobody had ever looked at her quite like this before, not with pity, not with the careful, performative kindness people sometimes extended to a woman they'd decided needed extra reassurance, but with something closer to recognition, as if he were finally reading a document he'd been handed months ago and had simply never gotten around to opening. Something shifted in Rocco's expression, not quite a smile, but close to it. The particular dark amusement of a dangerous man recognizing, with real and sudden respect, that he had badly misjudged the value of something standing right in front of him for 2 years. Who delivered the reserve case? He said, turning to the intercom on the wall. The answer, when it came 40 minutes later, arrived with a name that hit the room like a second gunshot: Nico Bellini, the Salvatore family's longtime wine broker, whose family had supplied their private reserve for 3 generations and whose younger brother had married 6 years ago into the Cortese family, the only crew in Boston with both the motive and the patience to spend 3 generations building trust with the Salvatores, purely so that trust could be weaponized on exactly the right night. The Corteses have been quiet for 18 months, Rocco said, pacing the length of his study while Odessa sat curled in the leather armchair by the window. A blanket someone had thoughtlessly, unexpectedly draped over her shoulders. Too quiet. I told my father's old capo it meant something. Nobody listened. They weren't quiet, Odessa said. They were patient. There's a difference. Vincent mentioned 3 weeks ago, in front of me, in this exact room, that you were planning to finalize the harbor contract renewal at tonight's dinner. He said it like I was a lamp. Nobody in this house has ever once considered that the woman arranging your flowers might also be listening to every word said within 10 feet of her. Rocco stopped pacing. He turned to look at her fully. something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes for just a moment, before the mask of the boss slid back into place. "You've been listening. For 2 years. I've been surviving," Odessa corrected quietly. "There's a difference between the two. But sometimes they look identical from the outside." The hour between the intercom's answer and their departure for the warehouse passed in a strange, suspended calm. Odessa sat with a mug of tea she didn't drink, watching Rocco move through the practiced, methodical business of assembling exactly the right number of men for exactly the situation, ahead no more. No less. Every decision made with the same precise economy she recognized in her own old lab work, where excess of any kind, whether reagent or manpower, was simply another variable that could go wrong. She understood, watching him, that this quiet, controlled version of Rocco Salvatore was probably more dangerous than the murderous fury she'd glimpsed in the dining room. Fury burned itself out. This did not. The confrontation with Nico Bellini happened just after midnight. In the cold, echoing storage warehouse where 3 generations of Bellini wine had passed through Salvatore hands without incident. Until tonight, Rocco brought 2 men. He did not bring Vincent, whose earlier cruelty had, in the space of a single evening, cost him every ounce of standing he'd built over a decade of loyal service, a fact Rocco had made clear with a single, quiet sentence before they left the estate. "You will apologize to Miss Marlowe before you ever address her again, or you won't be in a position to address anyone." Nico Bellini did not run when he saw them arrive. He simply sat very still on an overturned crate, a bottle of his own family's wine open and half-finished beside him, and looked at Rocco with the particular resignation of a man who had known. The moment his phone didn't ring with confirmation of a dead rival. Exactly how the rest of his night was going to go. "The Cortices paid off my debts," Nico said, before Rocco could speak. 300,000. My daughter needed the surgery. "Rocco, you know that. I asked you for help 8 months ago, and you told me family loans out of respect, not obligation. And I understood that. I did. But respect doesn't pay a cardiologist. So you decided murder was the more respectable option," Rocco said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I decided my daughter mattered more than your dinner table." Nico shot back, some of the old fire returning even now. "I laced 1 bottle. Rocco, 1. I told myself it wouldn't be my hand that killed you. Just my hand that opened the door. I told myself that made it different. It doesn't," Rocco said. "It just means you'll die knowing exactly how little the distinction mattered." Odessa, standing several feet back with a coat someone had draped over her florist's apron. I found herself speaking before she'd fully decided to. "Wait." Both men turned. "He's not the one who built this," she said, her mind already 3 steps ahead, cataloging the shape of what she'd overheard in the study an hour earlier. The timeline of Vincent's careless comment about the harbor contract. The 6 years of patient, invisible groundwork it would have taken the Cortices to place a compromised broker this close to a Salvatore table. He's a symptom. If you kill him tonight without pulling the rest of it out of him, the Cortices just find a different door next month. I want to know who on their side actually planned this. Not who poured the poison. Who chose the wine. Rocco studied her for a long moment in the cold warehouse light. And something in his chest, the same something that had unclenched 2 hours earlier in the dining room, settled a little further into place. "She's right," he said. And for the first time that night, there was something almost like warmth threaded through the ice in his voice. "Talk. Nico. Everything. Names. Dates. Every conversation you had with whoever recruited you. You do that, and your daughter still gets to have a father. Even if it's from a very great distance, and under conditions you will not enjoy. You don't. And this warehouse becomes the last place you ever stand." Nico's eyes flicked between Rocco and Odessa, weighing, for one final desperate moment, whether there was any version of tonight that didn't end with him losing everything. There wasn't. And some deep, exhausted part of him seemed to recognize that fact as clearly as Odessa had recognized the oleander in his family's wine. His shoulders dropped. Whatever fight had carried him this far, finally, visibly, drained out of him. It took Nico 11 minutes to give up everything: a name, a meeting location, a timeline stretching back 14 months that confirmed exactly what Odessa had suspected in the study. The Cortese underboss Dante Ferro had been quietly financing Nico's debts since well before his daughter's diagnosis, patiently building leverage for a night just like this one. Certain that a family as careful as the Salvatores would never think to look for treachery in something as mundane as a wine delivery. Dawn was still hours away when Rocco's men moved on. The address Nico had given them a converted boathouse on the Cortese side of the harbor, where Dante Ferro kept what he mistakenly believed was a secure operation. Odessa did not go. She had made her choice clear the moment the warehouse confrontation ended. She had spent 11 years learning to identify poison, not to pull triggers. And some lines, once you'd drawn them for yourself, were worth keeping. Even when the world around you made violence look easy, what she did instead was sit in the passenger seat of Rocco's car, parked 2 blocks from the boathouse, a police scanner and an encrypted radio balanced on her lap, and read his team through the timeline she had assembled from Nico's confession, which rooms Dante would most likely be using at this hour, which exits a man that Paranoid would have wired with alarms, which of his known associates was most likely to fold first under pressure. "I have spent 11 years being told my instincts don't matter," she thought, watching the boathouse's dark windows through the windshield, listening to the low crackle of Rocco's voice, confirming positions over the radio. 11 years of being the fat, quiet woman in the corner. Nobody thought to ask a real question. Tonight, the only thing standing between a poisoned bottle of wine and a funeral was the fact that I never stopped paying attention. Even after the world told me my attention wasn't worth anything. Odessa sat with the radio pressed to her ear, counting the seconds the way she used to count reaction times in the lab. Back when a delay of even a few seconds could mean the difference between a controlled experiment and a contaminated one. She had spent 11 years training herself out of panic, learning to let her mind keep working even when her body wanted to do nothing but freeze. And she found, sitting in the dark car 2 blocks from the boathouse, that the old discipline hadn't left her after all. It had just been waiting, the way so much of her had been waiting, for a night that finally needed it. The raid took 11 minutes. Dante Ferro did not go quietly. Odessa heard the exchange of gunfire crackle distantly through the radio, heard Rocco's voice, sharp and controlled, calling positions, heard the moment it finally, mercifully, went silent. When Rocco climbed back into the car 20 minutes later, his knuckles were split and his shirt was torn at the shoulder. But his eyes, when they found hers, in the dim light of the dashboard, had lost the murderous edge they'd carried since the dining room. "It's finished," he said. "Pharaoh's operation is done. The Cortesi family will spend the next 6 months explaining to the commission why one of their underbosses tried to poison a rival at his own dinner table over a harbor contract. That's not a war anyone survives with dignity." And Nico Odessa asked quietly, "Alive? Exiled? His daughter gets her surgery paid for out of what's left of his accounts, and he never sets foot in Boston again." Rocco's jaw tightened. "It's more mercy than the old rules would have allowed. I found I didn't have the stomach for less. Tonight. Not after watching you sit across from him and ask better questions than any of my own men would have thought to ask." They didn't speak again until they were back at the estate, in the quiet, gray hour before dawn. Standing in the kitchen, because neither of them had had the presence of mind to go anywhere else. Odessa still wore her flour-stained apron under the borrowed coat. Rocco still had blood, someone else's, drying at his collar. Neither of them looked away from the other. 2 years, Rocco said finally, his voice rough, in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Stripped of all its careful, deadly control. 2 years you walked in and out of my house, and I let my own men treat you like furniture. And the entire time you were the single most dangerous, most valuable person in the building, and none of us had the sense to see it. You saw the scar, Odessa said quietly. 6 months ago. You never asked. I was waiting, Rocco admitted, to see if you'd tell me on your own terms. Instead of mine, I've spent my whole life around people who only reveal what they are under pressure. I wanted to know what you'd choose to show me. Freely. If anyone ever bothered to make space for it. Nobody's made space for it in 11 years, Odessa said, and her voice cracked. Finally, on the exhaustion of an entire evening spent being brave in a language she hadn't used since the lab, I forgot what it felt like to be listened to instead of looked at. Rocco crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, the same unhurried, absolute certainty with which he crossed every room that mattered and reached up to brush a stray curl of hair away from her face with a gentleness that belonged to no other version of him that existed anywhere else in his life. I'm listening now, he said. I intend to keep listening for a very long time. Odessa Marlowe, if you'll let me. She looked up at him this cold. Precisi. Terrifying man who had just watched half a rival family collapse in a single night because someone had dared to threaten the woman he'd apparently been quietly, carefully cataloging for 2 years, and felt something in her chest that had been closed for 11 years crack open. Slow and unbearably warm. Like the first real light after a long winter. That depends, she said, some of her old dry humor finding its way back into her voice. On whether you're planning to actually pay attention to the flowers next time, or just to whether they're hiding anything lethal. Rocco Salvatore laughed a low, rough, startled sound that seemed to surprise even him. The sound of a man whose chest had unclenched for the first time in longer than he could remember. Both, he said, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. His hands finally, carefully settling at her waist as though she were something rare he'd only just been given permission to hold. From now on, both, outside the kitchen window. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to spread over Boston Harbor, and somewhere across the city, The Cortese family was waking up to discover exactly how thoroughly the woman they had never bothered to notice had unmade them in a single night. The days that followed the raid moved strangely for Odessa, half a return to normal life. Half an entirely new existence she hadn't asked for and wasn't sure yet how to hold. She still opened Boston Blooms most mornings, still lost herself in the familiar, grounding rhythm of trimming stems and building arrangements. But now there was always a car parked discreetly across the street. And always, by early afternoon, a message from Rocco asking, in his characteristically brief way, whether she'd eaten. She told herself it was gratitude. A man like Rocco Salvatore did not simply fall for the woman who had saved his life over a plate of ranunculus. Men like him rewarded loyalty, protected assets, kept score. She told herself this every day for a week. Right up until the afternoon, he showed up at the shop himself, in a suit clearly too fine for the cramped, fragrant little storefront, and stood awkwardly in the doorway, like a man who had walked into unfamiliar territory without a map. The car across the street, she came to understand, was not merely a precaution against the Cortese family's scattered remnants. It was the same instinct that had once made Rocco quietly file away the burn scar on her wrist without ever pushing her to explain it. The instinct of a man who paid attention first and asked questions only when the person in front of him was ready to answer them. She found, against every expectation she'd built over 11 guarded years, that she didn't mind being watched over quite as much as she'd assumed she would. "I don't know how to do this part," he admitted, when she finally looked up from the roses she was trimming, startled to find him there at all. The part where nobody's trying to kill anyone. "I'm better at emergencies than I am at Tuesday afternoons." "You're doing fine," Odessa said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. Most people start with coffee. He came back the next day with coffee, and the day after that. And by the end of the second week, the delivery drivers at Boston Blooms had started making quiet, knowing jokes about the dangerous-looking man who kept finding excuses to linger by the register. It would take weeks for the full shape of what had happened to settle into place. The commission hearings, the quiet absorption of what remained of Dante Ferro's territory, the slow, careful process of Rocco rebuilding a command structure that had nearly gotten him killed by a bottle of wine, because every man in it had decided a florist wasn't worth listening to. The rest of the household followed his example more quickly than Rocco had expected, not out of any particular warmth toward Odessa at first, but out of simple, practical self-preservation. Word traveled fast in a house like the Salvatore estate, and by the end of the week, every guard, every driver, every member of the kitchen staff understood precisely what had almost happened at that dinner table, and precisely whose quiet, careful attention had stopped it. The florist who used to slip in and out through the service entrance without a second glance now found herself greeted by name, offered the good parking spot near the front steps, asked, with genuine and slightly nervous deference, whether the flowers for next week's meeting needed anything special. Odessa found the sudden reversal almost harder to process than the danger itself had been. There was, she thought more than once in those first strange days, a particular kind of vertigo in being believed so completely and so suddenly, after a decade of learning to expect the opposite by default. She had spent 11 years learning to expect very little from rooms full of powerful people, and it took her longer than she expected to stop bracing. Out of pure habit. For the cruelty to come back around in some new shape. It never did. Rocco made sure of that. In the quiet, thorough way, he made sure of everything that mattered to him. A single conversation with his senior men, delivered once, without theatrics, that nonetheless rearranged the entire social architecture of the household overnight. But that morning, in the pale gray kitchen light, none of it had happened yet. There was only Odessa, still in her flour-stained apron, and Rocco, still marked with the night's violence, and the strange, fragile, entirely unfamiliar sensation for both of them of being fully seen by someone who had finally bothered to look. "Stay," Rocco said, when the silence had stretched long enough that either of them might have made an excuse to leave it. It wasn't a command. For once, it was something closer to a request. Rougher and more uncertain than anything she had ever heard from him. "Not just tonight. I have a business that needs someone who can see what everyone else misses. And I have a house full of men who owe you their boss's life. I'd like you to stay for all of it." Odessa thought about the little apartment 3 blocks from Boston Bloom's. The quiet, careful life she had built out of the wreckage of the one she'd lost 11 years ago and found, to her own considerable surprise, that she wasn't afraid of the answer forming in her chest. Boston would never know how close its harbor politics had come to reshaping themselves in a single, quiet night over a poisoned bottle of Barolo. The commission hearings would settle into the usual careful language of territorial disputes and leadership transitions. And within a year, most of the city's underworld would remember the Cortese collapse as an internal squabble over shipping rights. Nothing more. Nobody outside the Salvatore estate would ever know that the entire chain of events had turned on the attention of a florist. Nobody had thought to really look at that. The difference between a funeral and a wedding. In the end, had come down to 11 years of hard-won expertise nearly no one had bothered to ask about. Rocco would remember it differently, in the years that followed, than the rest of the city ever could. He would remember the exact sound of glass shattering against marble, the exact half-second before he understood what it meant, and the way his entire understanding of the woman beside him had reordered itself in the space of a single sentence. He would tell people, much later, when the two of them had built something neither of them had quite dared to name that first gray morning in the kitchen, that he had fallen in love with Odessa Marlowe twice once, quietly, over months of watching her cut stems at precise diagonal angles and choose her words with unusual care. And once, all at once, the instant she stood up in a room full of armed men and told his own lieutenant not to speak to her that way again. "I suppose someone has to keep checking the wine," she said softly, and let him pull her the rest of the way into the warmth of his arms. The whole, dangerous, glittering, unfinished shape of whatever came next, still waiting for both of them past the window, where the sun was finally beginning to rise.